Welcome to the Sorry Supernatural YouTube channel. My name is Hazel and I will be your host today. Today's case is the Enfield Poltergeist. Before we get started, I'd just like to say we have a Facebook group, and if you would like to join it, then I will leave the link in the description below. Let's get on with it. Peggy Hodson and her 4 children lived in a 1920s house in Green Street, Enfield, London. Peggy was a single mum who had recently got divorced from her husband. In August of 1977, this council house became famous worldwide for some unexplainable happenings. On the 30th of the same month, Peggy heard a lot of noise coming from upstairs, and she went to tell her children to be quiet and stop fighting and to just go to sleep. But the children protested. They said they couldn't go to sleep because their beds were moving around. Peggy thought no more about their protests and she went to bed herself. The next night, Peggy heard a strange shuffling noise, as if someone was walking across lino in their slippers, followed by 4 loud knocks coming from the walls of the house. All of a sudden, a large chest of drawers slid across the floor towards her, all by itself. Peggy pushed the drawers back into place, but as soon as she did, the drawers moved again. But this time, Peggy could not return the drawers back to where they had come from. This was the point where Peggy decided that something strange was going on and did not want to stay in the house anymore. She grabbed her kids and ran next door to 282, where the Nottingham family lived. She told them what was happening, and Vic Nottingham and his son Gary went around to investigate what was going on. When they entered the house, they were shocked. There were loud knocks coming from all over the house. Vic decided that someone was playing a joke and decided to call the police. At 1 o'clock that night, the police arrived. They entered the house and they checked around, checking the walls, the pipes, for anything that could be causing the knocking. One police officer went into the kitchen to check the refrigerator, just to see if it was that pipes making the noise. The other police officer stood in the living room with the family, and they had the lights off. All of a sudden, the Hodgson's eldest son pointed to the chair next to the sofa. The chair was wobbling backwards and forwards all by itself, but then suddenly it slid across the floor and then just came to an abrupt stop. The police officer standing with the family checked the chair and could find no reason as to why the chair would move like that. The next night, Vic went round to check on the house. When he entered, he stood there shocked as bits of Lego and marbles were flying around the house, some even hitting him. Over the next few days, several people would enter the house, from council officials and even members of the clergy. On the 4th of September, Mrs. Nottingham, not knowing what else to do, decided to call the Daily Mirror to see if they could help in some way. The Daily Mirror sent reporter Douglas Bence and photographer Graham Morris to the house to investigate what was going on. Graham Morris later said, "I thought it was an ordinary job until I walked into the house. I stood in the gloom of the kitchen, and one by one the kids were brought in the adults' arms, and the last one to come in was Janet. Suddenly, things took off and started flying around the room. I was hit by a Lego brick over my right eye. It gave me a lump for a few days. There was a fair bit of force. There were marbles and things left in the kitchen that were just flying around the room. It was what was watching all the family, and none of them were doing anything." 2 more members of the Daily Mirror staff came to the house to see what was happening for themselves. Senior reporter George Fallows and photographer David Thorpe were shocked to see what was happening. Fallows said, "At first I thought Peggy was playing tricks just to get a new council house, but I soon realised something more serious was happening." Fallows suggested contacting the Society of Psychic Research, as they should be able to help out. Upon receiving the request, a gentleman called Maurice Gross volunteered to investigate the goings-on. Maurice Gross was born on the 6th of March 1919 and was an inventor, but later became famous for his role in the investigation. On the 5th of September, Maurice entered the house for the first time, not knowing what he was walking into. He stated, "I found chaos. The whole family was congregated in the house together with the neighbours next door, and there was a lot of very, very frightened people there." Morris, along with members of the press, waited in the house for an incident to occur, when on the 8th of September at around 11:15 p.m. they heard a large crash come from the children's bedroom. Morris rushed upstairs to find Janet and her sister Margaret fast asleep, but a chair that was in the room had somehow flipped over and slid roughly a metre across the room. This one incident was the thing that made Morris decide that he would stay and investigate further. On the 10th of September, the Daily Mirror ran the story with a headline saying, "The House of Strange Happenings." Later on that evening, Peggy was on LBC Radio, a radio station based in London, talking about the strange going on in her house. When Peggy returned home that night, she was met by Ros Morris, a reporter for a show called The World This Weekend that aired on BBC Radio 4. Ros joined Morris on an all-night visual that night, and she was to witness some paranormal activity. After the girls had retired to bed that night, there was a loud crash from their room. Ros said after, "Something chucked the chair across the room. I'm convinced of that." Morris was to witness other strange incidents, things like marbles, teaspoons and books flying around the house. One instance that Morris witnessed was a sofa which somehow rose into the air, flipped and then crashed to the floor. He wasn't alone in witnessing these strange occurrences. Neighbours and reporters also witnessed different things happening. Morris and a photographer set out to try and capture these events on camera. They would do this by setting up a camera that would take a picture whenever movement was present. One instance that was captured with this setup was Janet somehow being thrown from her bed. Morris realised that this case was too big for him to handle alone and returned to the SPR to ask for help. A gentleman called Lion Playfair heard what was happening and decided to give Morris a hand in investigating, and arrived for the first time on the 12th of September. Lion Playfair was born in British India on the 5th of April 1935 and was the son of a British Army officer. He went on to do national service where he was a translator for the Royal Air Force in India. After he finished his national service, he became a journalist for the Life magazine. In the 1960s, he decided he would move to Rio de Janeiro, and for 10 years he worked as a freelance journalist. It was in Brazil where he became interested in the paranormal after he had direct experience with a psychic healer. In 1973, he investigated a poltergeist outbreak in a private apartment in Sao Paulo, and then later that year he decided he would join the SPR. On the 28th of September, Peggy and her family were chased out of the house by the entity and went to stay with her brother, who lived further up on the same road. The wife of Peggy's brother went into the kitchen to make the family a cup of tea when suddenly a Lego brick appeared in front of her and dropped onto the table. It was then that the family realised whatever it was could actually follow them out of the house. During this time that all these occurrences were happening, Morris and Guy were to witness indents on pillows as if somebody was laying there. There was a rumour that the entity could be a spirit of a 4-year-old girl who had been killed by her father. He had smothered her with a pillow. Peggy had apparently been given some furniture for the house when she first moved in, and it is thought maybe that the entity was attached to a piece of the furniture. She decided she would just throw the furniture and see if things stopped, but unfortunately this wasn't the case. It seemed as if Janet was the centre of everything that was happening. Some people believe that young girls around the age of puberty are the ones that seem to be the centre of poltergeist activity. Janet wasn't the only one who was affected by what was happening. Peggy claimed that before anything happened, she always seemed to get a headache. Janet's sister Margaret said that sometimes she would have the same dream as Janet at the exact same time. Somehow, Janet still seemed to be the main focus of the entity's attention. Apparitions started to appear, and a brother of a neighbour saw a strange light about a foot tall burning in a window before fading away. A physicist called David Robertson attempted to secretly film Janet, but he found it incredibly difficult to hide the camera equipment. However, he did manage to catch some unexplainable things. This was to include a sideboard turning over, Janet rising into the air, and a cushion somehow being transported onto the roof of the house. The council would not rehouse the Hodgsons, but instead they agreed they would pay for them to go on holiday to Clacton-on-Sea for the half-term holidays. While the family were away in Clacton, hardly anything happened in the house apart from strange barking coming from Janet's bed. On the 5th of November, when the family returned from their holiday, Morris decided he would try and communicate with the entity using knocks, 1 knock for no and 2 knocks for yes. Morris asked, "Did you used to live in this house?" 2 knocks were heard from the wall. "Was it more than 15 years ago?" Again, 2 knocks were heard from the wall. "Did you die in this house?" 2 knocks again were heard. "Are you unhappy?" This time only 1 knock was heard. "Why are you here?" "Have you a special message for us?" And again there was only 1 knock. Morris then asked, "Are you having a game with me?" This time there was no knock, but instead the spirit threw a cardboard box and a pillow, hitting Morris in the face. On the 10th of November, which was Janet's birthday, Guy invited a Argentinian psychic to the house. The psychic brought with him a device to measure the electromagnetic field around the house. While he was walking around the house, Janet's pillows were thrown about the room, and the psychic noted that when this happened, there was a change within the electromagnetic field. On the 14th of November, Janet decided to leave pen and paper lying around the house, as the psychic had suggested, to see if the entity would write any messages down. All of a sudden, messages started appearing on the paper that was left. Peggy found one that said, "I will stay in this house. Do not read this to anyone or I will retaliate." Soon, another message was found in the living room, which read, "Can I have a tea bag?" Peggy placed a tea bag on the table and suddenly a ripped tea bag appeared next to it. Peggy's ex turned up and without thinking, Peggy grabbed the note and showed it to him. Soon as he left, Peggy realised what she had done, apologised for showing him the note, when all of a sudden another one appeared saying, "It was a misunderstanding, don't do it again, I know who that was." It was noted that in fact the writing was very similar to how Janet wrote. On the 29th of November, a Brazilian psychic turned up at the house with his interpreter, who was a member of the healing department of the Sao Paulo Spiritual Federation. They decided to give the family some spiritual healing, which seemed to calm things down for a bit. The interpreter went into a trance-like state and started to draw and paint some pictures. Not long after they left, Janet started to go into a trance and would draw some disturbing pictures as well. For some reason, wrote the word Watson over and over again on a piece of paper. At a later date, it was discovered that a family called Watson had once lived in the house, and the wife had died of a tumour in her throat, which had burst. The frightening thing was that the pictures that Janet had been drawing actually looked similar to this. On the 29th of November, a Brazilian psychic turned up at the house with his interpreter, who was a member of the healing department of the Sao Paulo Spiritual Federation. They decided to give the family some spiritual healing, which seemed to calm things down for a bit. The interpreter went into a trance-like state and started to draw and paint some pictures. Not long after they left, Janet started to go into a trance and would draw some disturbing pictures as well. For some reason, wrote the word Watson over and over again on a piece of paper. At a later date, it was discovered that a family called Watson had once lived in the house, and the wife had died of a tumour in her throat, which had burst. The frightening thing was that the pictures that Janet had been drawing actually looked similar to this. On the 3rd of December, Janet was pulled out of bed, and when Morris found her, she was sliding down the stairs head first, still fast asleep. A couple of days later, a student physicist and a member of the SPR by the name of David Roberts joined the team. On the 10th of December, 2 more members of the SPR were to visit the house, a Dr. John Beloff and Anita Gregory. They decided all together to challenge the entity to speak, and there was met with some loud bangs and whistling. All of a sudden, a deep, gruff voice came through, calling himself Joe Watson. However, the next night when the spirit was asked to talk, it was not to call itself Joe Watson, but instead Bill Wilkins. On Tuesday the 13th of December, Morris was joined by his son Richard, who had recently qualified as a solicitor and had come to the house to help his dad investigate what was happening. The spirit would often just respond in knocks and bangs when asked questions, but soon a deep voice could be heard, coming from the vicinity of Janet's neck. When asked, the spirit said that his name was Bill Wilkins, who had died in the house previously when he was 72. Richard asked how he had died, and the voice replied, "I went blind, I had a hemorrhage, I fell asleep, and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs." Bill Wilkins' son was asked later how his father had actually died, and he said that everything the voice said was 100% true. Guy then asked why he was invisible to them, to which Bill replied, "I'm invisible because I'm a GHOST. To rule out the possibility of Janet making the voice deliberately, Morris decided to try a couple of things. First, he placed tape over Janet's mouth, but the voice was still heard. So he asked Janet to hold water in her mouth, but yet again, the voice was still coming through. Morris managed to get hours of recording of the voice by using a microphone taped to Janet's neck. Morris and Guy decided to get a speech therapist in to examine Janet, but even they were confused as to where the voice was coming from. They said though there was some resemblance to a false vocal cord tone, this is where a muscle behind the throat can produce sounds independent of the vocal cords. However, this would cause an extremely sore throat and the possibility of some serious damage. Janet had none of these. Even though the voice could go on for up to 3 hours at a time, it was decided
Morris
that
and Guy
decided to see if they could get answers by hypnotising
Janet,
Janet. So they called in Dr. Ian Fletcher, who was a hypnotist surgeon and also a member of the Magic Circle. Dr. Fletcher hypnotised Janet and asked the questions. "Do you know who is doing this?" Janet replied, "Me and my sister." "Why do you think you are to blame?" The reply came, "I don't know who is." "What does it feel like?" Janet then replied, It's like cold hands gripping me around my body." "Who started the trouble?" Janet replied, "None of us." "What is the cause of the trouble?" To which Janet replied, "An increase in unhappiness." After the session, Dr. Fletcher said, "The impression I have formed was this is not fraud. She and her sister are doing some of these things, maybe springing out of their beds, but something is forcing them against their will." Not long after this, Janet started to levitate, and on the 15th of December at around 11:45 p.m, the local lollipop lady witnessed Janet floating around her room. On the 23rd of December, the family's goldfish suddenly died, and Bill admitted that he had killed it by electrocuting it with spirit energy. On Christmas Day, the family's parakeet was found dead in its cage, but later there was a much more worrying incident going to happen. Later on that day, Janet was found hanging with a curtain wrapped around her neck. Peggy managed to untangle the curtain from around her neck, which stopped Janet from suffocating. Janet was then to complain that a knife was following her around upstairs. Peggy checked the knives in the kitchen and found that, in fact, some of the knives she had put away were in fact missing and on the stairs. Janet later said, "I was used and abused. There was levitations, there was the voices, and then there was the curtain that wrapped itself around my neck, which was quite threatening for me, and it brought home to me that this could kill you." On the 15th of January, which was also Peggy's birthday, writing in fecal matter was found on the wall, followed by a few days of puddles of diarrhea, which was then sent away to a lab for testing. When the results came back, it was found it was in fact cat urine. A few days later, Peggy said she witnessed a man walking upstairs, and then a few days later, the words "I am Fred" was found on the bathroom door, written in electrical tape. The SPR formed a committee on the 16th of May to investigate the case. They re-interviewed any witnesses they found were credible and convincing, and they consulted a Charles Moses, who was an experienced investigator for the Southern Californian Society of Psychic Research. The committee came to the conclusion that there was a good evidence for paranormal phenomena and refused to give any credit to the voice of Bill Wilkins. On the 25th of July, Janet was sent to a psychiatric hospital in South London, and all the incidents seemed to die down, but the family still saw the occasional apparition. Dr. Peter Fletcher carried out several tests on Janet, but could find nothing wrong. This included tests for brain damage and epilepsy. After nearly 6 weeks, Janet returned home, and within half an hour, Janet witnessed an apparition of a little boy. On Monday the 2nd of October, a Dutch medium was called in who claimed to travel along the astral plane to contact spirits. The medium came to the conclusion that there was a 24-year-old woman involved in the case. Morris had a daughter who was tragically killed in a crash when she was 24. It was after this tragic loss and some strange occurrences that Morris decided he would join the SPR, which would lead him to this case. The medium identified who the 24-year-old woman was, and after the incident seemed to taper off, and finally, after 2 years, they stopped. Morris kept in touch with the family until the time of his death in 2006. Peggy remained in the house until she passed away in 2003. Janet's younger brother tragically died at the age of 14. Janet was to leave the home when she was only 16 and went on to marry early in her life. After it all happened, both Janet and her sister Margaret had made several television appearances where they continued to say that everything they experienced was true. Janet said in 2011 in a newspaper article, "Years later, when Mum was alive, there was always a presence, there was something watching over you." And that is the end of today's case. Thank you for staying till the end. If you enjoyed this and you'd like to hear more from us, please hit the like button, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Are you afraid of the dark? Are you scared?